But now I will take a moment to introduce our guest speaker, Margie Searl. Margie retired from MAG in 2013, so this is really shortly before I arrived. But I would like to say that she's been a wonderful colleague for me and a great, has provided a lot of wonderful support, intellectual, historical, archival content on our collection. I mean, she is a tremendous resource and has a wealth of knowledge. Frankly, if I have a question about almost anything, I know that I can call on Margie and she will answer. I don't often have to call her. I see her at the gym when the gym is open. So that makes life very convenient for me. She's very fit as well as smart. So that's a double, she deserves a lot of credit for that as well. But let me be a little more serious. Margie retired in 2013 after 25 years in the education and curatorial departments at the MAG. She retired as chief curator. She contributed to a number of acquisitions, installations, and exhibitions, including some amazing works of art, including Jacob Lawrence's Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman series, Head, Heart, and Hand, Elbert Hubbard, and the Roycrofters. These are the exhibitions that she's worked on. Leaving the Country, George Bellows at Woodstock, and of course the Centennial Sculpture Park, which is such a great asset, such a wonderful part of our museum and its presence in the community. She also worked on publications, including Seeing America, Painting and Sculpture from the collection of the MAG, which remains one of our key handbooks for getting access to the collection and understanding its depth and its richness. She's done a lot of work researching and writing about, teaching and engaging with MAG's permanent collection. She says that this has been her great love. And now with Lou Harper, who is our retired MAG librarian, Margie focuses on the development of the Sibley Watson Digital Archive, which is a website that houses ongoing research, writing, images, and papers pertaining to Emily Sibley Watson, founder of the Memorial Art Gallery, and her family and social circle. Most exciting moments at MAG, according to Margie, watching Garth Fagan's company dance for Jacob and Gwen Lawrence. Wow, wish I had been there for that. Meeting the Kubanim, acquiring Pittsford on the Erie Canal for the collection, hosting George Bellows' family at the opening of her, I'm sure the Bellows exhibition, staying up all night with Kathy DeMonda while Seeing America went to press. That sounds fun too, tiring but fun. I hope you had a toast and a little champagne. And taking down portions of the University Avenue fence to make the grounds more accessible to the public. And she adds, one of her other great pleasures and rewarding experiences was keeping up with Grant Holcomb. So before I pass the mic to Margie, I just want to remind you that if you have questions, put them into the Q&A or chat if you like throughout the lecture. There's a chat function and a Q&A function, but the Q&A is better. And we will get to those questions at the end. So now, Margie, thank you for joining us today, and it's yours to take away.
Okay. Hi. Thank you, Jonathan, for inviting me to give today's presentation to Director Searl. And thank you, Bella, for coordinating everything so well. Really, it's been terrific. Hello to the Zoom world out there. I know that I know many of you who are here today, and thank you for attending. Okay, there we go. We're in the most oddly different times than when Jonathan extended this invitation to me. We were at the gym, as he mentioned, where we would see each other most frequently in our workout clothes. I had just finished a Pilates class where, because of Midtown's construction, my workout pals and I were shoehorned in with our equipment within arm's length of each other and breathing each other's air, which is just such a hard thing to remember when and how we did that. In trying to decide whether I would be in town in June, I checked in with my son to see if I'd be needed to do childcare. And we figured that he and his family would be in Turkey now visiting the other grandparents. And was there enough time to do new research to present to this group? I was not concerned. The university archivist was going to obtain permission for me to see Rush Reese's papers to see if there was new material to add to existing histories. No problem, right? I had covered all the bases except for one. I had never considered how a pandemic would affect my plans and everyone else's. And suddenly the channel changed. I had to learn to use Zoom. I had to calculate the risk in visiting my hair salon to look at least somewhat presentable. Then in the middle of trying to rise to those challenges while continuing to move forward with my program, violence broke out only a bit more than a mile from my home, and I'm now under curfew. Not that I'd be going anywhere because of COVID. And I might add, this intro was written a few weeks ago. And yet fresh aftershocks continue. I'm not under curfew, but every day we wake up and we think, what is next? As these thoughts went through my brain, I thought too about times at MAG that posed challenges, presenting the Jacob Lawrence exhibition during the ice storm, preparing to open the George Bellows exhibition, where his elderly daughter and her family were coming from California to be guests of honor, and discovering that the roof over the Grand Gallery, now the Docent Gallery, required a complete do-over, and the exhibition might not be able to be installed in time for the opening for fear of rain pouring through the ceiling on the paintings. Another year, the discovery of insects in the Grand Gallery that required the postponement of one exhibition and the doubling up with another when the insect coast was cleared. We had a very detailed disaster plan that covered bomb threats, flooding, everything but a pandemic. Okay, let's see if we can go to the next slide. These thoughts led me back to the earliest years of MAG, its first decade. Putting those years under the microscope, we find challenges marked by life and death, by political struggles, and also by strength and generosity. I will focus on three of these: women, war, and Watsons, in particularly Emily Sibley Watson. In particular, Emily Sibley Watson. These early years have been chronicled by MAG historian Betsy Brayer and depicted in the Centennial book created by Kathy Demanda and her team. Online resources may be found in the two websites shown here. The MAG History Timeline that's on the website and Sibley Watson Digital Archive. All you have to do is type that in and it will take you to the URL. I would like to acknowledge the expertise and constant partnership of Lou Harper, retired MAG librarian, for years of joyful research that we hope will resume before long. Okay, next slide. Who does not know by now in this group of MAG friends the circumstances of the founding of MAG in 1913? A grieving mother had lost her shining star of a son to typhoid fever, a communicable disease, nearly 10 years before, and chose to honor his memory with the gift to the community of an art museum. And on the left, you see a young Emily Sibley Watson. It certainly was not Emily when MAG opened, and she didn't play the tambourine for the opening. But it's a happy and joyful and optimistic picture, which I really love to look at. MAG on the right, it's a rendering, an early rendering, and we know it's an early rendering because there are still no sculptures on the plinths in front of the building as was proposed in the early plans. Maybe someday. Next slide, please. Long a supporter of the Rochester Art Club, Emily Sibley Watson could see this possibility of building a museum also as an opportunity to give that group a home and a museum in which to hold exhibitions. The gratitude of the club was expressed in a letter to her presented by MAG's first director, which we will get to in a minute. I think I'm a little bit out of sync here. So on the left is a picture of Emily with her two children. Most people don't know that she had two children. She had James G. Averill, for whom the gallery was named, and then she had a little girl. And whose name was Louise, who's holding her doll there. And Louise died of diphtheria when she was 9 years old. Emily lost two children to communicable disease. J.G. Averill, for whom the gallery is named, is seen in the photograph on the right. He's seated beside an Egyptian sculpture, which I think is a wonderful photograph, with a friend of his who's smoking a cigarette and has also given a cigarette to the head of the pharaoh. In any event, that's JG probably shortly before he developed typhoid and died. And of course, One of the other things that Emily gave to the gallery in his memory was the sculpture called Memory, which is upstairs on the second floor. Okay, next. So you can see here the letter from George Hurdle, at that time the president of the Rochester Art Club, in which he is sending resolutions from the art club to Emily Sibley Watson, full of very high-flying language and very uplifting and very thankful and positive, and talking about the importance of the gift of the gallery. This gift to the people is of the highest importance to the moral and aesthetic uplift of our citizens, gives dignity and high opportunity for the conservation of the fine arts, and places Rochester on a par with the leading art centers of the nation. So very, very high expectations in 1912, before the building was even built, but they had great plans. Next slide. By this time, the University of Rochester had been a coeducational institution for 13 years, and MAG was certainly used by all students, male and female. However, coeducation did not translate, surprisingly enough, into an embrace of suffrage. If you look on what's on my right, I'm hoping it's on your right too, I think so, the list of board of directors of the Memorial Art Gallery, this is the first board, the original board of directors. Nearly half of the first board consisted of powerful and socially prominent women. It's very interesting to me because, as we'll see in a minute, it was not always the case in other museums. The men and the women seemed to be divided. The men were on the left, the women were on the right. The most prominent among them, Emily Sibley Watson, always was at the top of the page in every annual report, without a title through 1924, representing herself. We might take women's board presence for granted, but by comparison, as an example, in its early years, the Albright Art Gallery in Buffalo, while it had a female art director, had no women on its board. So in retrospect, I think this is rather unusual. Next slide, please. So I was very surprised to learn that she, who was said never to have spoken publicly, and I'm thinking that I left something out, and I'm going to have to, hang on. This is why I'm, sorry. I'm just going to read a little paragraph. The gallery starts in part with a woman, Emily Sibley Watson, of whom two who knew her, Gertrude Hurdle Moore and her sister Isabel, said in oral histories collected by Betsy Brayer, she was a much privileged person and had to be spared any disturbance. She never spoke a public word, ever. She had such small hands, I was always amazed, and small feet. They never looked like they could do anything. And yet, this is me speaking now, not Gertrude and Isabel, those feet carried her nearly halfway around the world, and her hands have touched the lives of millions through her actions. So, getting back to where I was very surprised to learn that she, who was said never to have spoken publicly, and who did not, in fact, appear at the dedication of the gallery that she founded in 1913, came out publicly as an anti-suffragist 2 years later. And we can see her, I don't know if this cursor shows anything, but if you look in the red circle, you can see the name of Mrs. James S. Watson under the membership committee of the anti-suffragists. The chair of the committee was her very good friend and fellow Nile traveler, Mrs. James Breck Perkins, assisted by the vice chair, Mrs. Rush Reese, who was the wife of the president of the University of Rochester. Not only was Harriet Seeley Reese the wife of the president of a co-ed university, but she was the daughter of the first president of Smith College, a school founded specifically to educate women. And her father was also an anti-suffragist. So we have some very interesting women who stood up against having women get the right to vote. And some of them were on the MAG, some of them were on this committee with Emily. And this is a whole list, by the way, of women who do not want to vote. And it's extremely interesting. The membership committee is on the right, but many, many, many women did not think in 1915 that women should have the right to vote. Next slide, please. The remaining female board members comprised an interesting and diverse group who, if they were not out as suffragists, were active in women's causes and had, in some cases, careers. Chief among the suffragists was Mrs. Henry Danforth, who you see in the photograph here. Edwina Blake Danforth, for whom Danforth Dining Hall was named at the University of Rochester, had a history of working for women's causes for a number of years prior to her role on the board, and continued to hold leadership positions in women's suffrage organizations. She ultimately became the first woman president of the Rochester City School Board. She is credited with supporting free membership in the early years at MAG, as well as scholarship classes for children, school children. You might be aware of the home she shared with her husband, Henry Danforth, a lawyer and a congressman. It is now the Danforth Community Center on 200 West Avenue, which she donated to the city later in her life. She served the MAG board for many, many years. Next slide, please. In the center, we see Dr. Elizabeth Denio. She was another of the first of the board members. She is considered to be the first woman professor at the University of Rochester, where she taught art history. Her salary was paid largely by Emily Sibley Watson. Interesting that Mrs. Watson would support a woman academic, but would not want her to be able to vote. Local lore in Albion, her birthplace, conjectures that she became accustomed to men's clothing while studying in Germany, for upon her return to this country, she was seen to appear in pants and supposedly enjoyed cigars, which I wonder if she smoked at the board meetings. If we move down the list, that we saw on the previous slide, we saw Mrs. Jessie Lindsay, who was also a member of Mrs. Danforth's suffragist group, Mrs. William Taylor, Emily Sibley Watson's Prince Street neighbor, whose husband, the pastor at Brick Church, espoused liberal causes, and both of whom were suffragists. Betty Averill, a cousin of Mrs. Watson's first husband, Isaac Averill, was an interior designer who assisted George Hurdle in the design choices for MAG's 1913 opening. Mrs. Granger Hollister was Mrs. Watson's sister-in-law and one of the donors of her family home to the Women's Educational and Industrial Union, an organization that supported women's economic independence. Marie Willard, Mrs. Watson's niece, while not a suffragist, as no one in the Sibley family was, with the exception of another younger niece, had provided the first ambulance service to the city of Rochester. These were women who got things done. I just wanted to call your attention while we're still on this slide to the page that says current fund account, which shows Mrs. William Taylor and Mrs. James Sibley Watson, who were funding Mrs. Denio's, Professor Denio's salary. And then also on the right, in the caption, the call out that says equal suffrage, we see the names of William Taylor and Annie Taylor also on the board of MAG, and a suffragist as early as 1893. So we can see that there were some real polarities of opinion on that board. Knowing of board, next slide please. Knowing of board connections with the suffrage movement, it comes as no surprise then that a portrait of Susan B. Anthony hung in the gallery in 1918, 9 years after the suffragist's death. Painted by Anthony's dear friend, Sarah Eddy, a suffragist from New Hampshire, the painting would remain in Rochester after its exhibition at MAG. It first hung above a fireplace in the Women's Building, Anthony Memorial Hall, now Visual Studies Workshop, and currently is located in the Susan B. Anthony Room at City Hall. Leaving the women's suffrage issue to move on to the Great War, I just wish to emphasize the enigmatic aspect of Mrs. Watson's involvement with the antis, juxtaposed with a definite pro-suffrage stance of at least 3 of the women she had presumably handpicked for her board. We don't have any letters that really talk about this, and which is too bad, and I'm not sure we will ever find any, but it is enough to know that it was not a rubber stamp board by any means, I don't think. Okay, next slide. In 1914, the year following MAG's opening, the Watson family may have had one of the earliest encounters with the outbreak of World War I when on one of their annual European cruises on their 140-foot yacht Genesee, They were stopped in Stockholm and told that they needed to turn back and not proceed to St. Petersburg, Russia, as planned. As recounted in the newspaper article by Emily's son, James Sibley Watson Jr., there were torpedo boats and destroyers all about, and the Genesee was the only merchant or passenger vessel among the formidable collection of warships. Next slide, please. The war came to MAG in 1917, the year that America joined up. The gallery exhibited lithographs of British and American war work by Joseph Pennell, and he spoke on the wonder of war work in December. A few months later, a print of soldiers marching at Fort Devens in Massachusetts was purchased and given to MAG by Mrs. Watson. What was not yet known was that 6 months following, in September 1918, Fort Devens was ground zero for the second outbreak of the influenza pandemic. And here's Fort Devens here. You can see very small soldiers that are marching in formation. And that was to be where influenza began to spread in 1918. Soldiers like the ones marching in this print, symptomatic and asymptomatic, would fan out to battlefields and take the flu with them. It is difficult to determine the impact of the flu on MAG. Schools, churches, saloons, and theaters were closed. Whether or not MAG fell under these guidelines, we do not yet know, or at least I do not yet know. One MAG contribution that we do know about is that when many entities were closed because of the Heatless Monday rules that were imposed during the war as a means of saving fuel so that it could be shipped to our allies, museums were exempt, and George Hurdle kept MAG open free to the public on each of the 9 Heatless Mondays to provide a respite for those who could not work or be in school. As well, the U of R Bursa reported that the membership committee had voted to defer sending out renewal notices until after the National Liberty Loan was completed as a gesture of loyalty. And in his 1917 appeal letter for membership sent by Rush Reese, he described the gallery as a ministry to the spiritual life of our community. Annual reports give us some indication that of the challenges that there were to contend with. From the 1918 annual report, the attendance at the gallery from April 6th to April 1917 to April 7th, 1918 was 42,029, of which number 32,000 came on free days. It's gratifying to point out the increase of nearly 4,000 over last year's attendance, especially as this represents a period practically coincident with our country's first year of war. The work and influence of the gallery are broadening steadily year by year, and it is our hope that in war as in peace, it may prove a source of inspiration for all the people. In 1919's annual report, in presenting the report of the activities of the Memorial Art Gallery in its 6th year, just think of it, only 6 years in existence, which is coincident with the country's transition from war to the period of readjustment, it is gratifying to note that the work of the gallery has not only been maintained, but has been broadened and extended to a wider circle than in the years immediately preceding, with over 50,000 visitors, an increase of nearly 9,000 over the previous year. And despite the influenza epidemic and later the government's embargo on express shipments, the succession of exhibitions has been regularly adhered to. Next slide, please. War-related exhibitions continue to be made available to the public. Without instant access to images, the public relied on a limited number of sources: newspapers, magazines, newsreels in movie theaters, and art exhibitions. As mentioned, Pennell's exhibition about war work was one. Others were brought in from time to time, but none blew up in the way that George Bellow's 1919 exhibition depicting the brutality of German soldiers to the Belgian population, reports of which tore Bellows up terribly. He painted some of these very large scenes of brutality in response to the massacre of innocent citizens in the town of Dinant. You can see victims on the ground. You can see people raising their fists up to the heavens. You can see people looking down mournfully. You can see children crying, and you can see women sobbing with their arms up in the air. It was just a scene of devastation, and George Bellows felt that it was his artistic responsibility to document all of it. And George Hurdle felt that it was his responsibility to bring it to Rochester. Next slide, please. However, it was not received well by everyone. James Gould Cutler, who was the ex-mayor of Rochester and also a Sibley and Watson family friend, complained. He wrote a letter to Rush Reese, who's in the center there, saying that these paintings were too brutal to be exhibited and should be removed. This was possibly the first time that someone spoke to a director about taking down something from the walls. It's happened again since, not too often, but this, I think, was the first time. Gertrude Hurdle recalls President Reese coming to her father and saying, "I just really have one thing to ask of you. What is your opinion of Bellows as a painter?" Her father replied, "I think he's one of the great figures of contemporary American art." And Reese replied, "That's all I want to know." And the paintings remained on view. It was a strong university president supporting his director. Next slide, please. We've come to know recently that Emily Sibley Watson was herself quite active during World War I. In the year 1917 alone, the year that the United States entered World War I, she donated nearly $30,000 to war relief programs, the equivalent of nearly $2 million today. You can see this is just a small sample on her stationery, which is embossed with 11 Prince Street. War Relief Clearinghouse, American Women's War Relief, Russian War Relief, American Artists Committee, Armenian Relief, socks, Rochester Fund for French Wounded. She was incredibly generous, and this was just for 1 year. Her son, James Sibley Watson Jr., had volunteered to drive an ambulance in France, leaving behind a pregnant wife. Mrs. Watson wrote to her daughter-in-law, Hildegard Lascelles Watson, in August 1917, "I knit a great deal, as there seems to be no end of knitted things needed. We have all been working hard to fit out the battleship Louisiana with 800 sets of sweaters, mufflers, wristlets, helmets, and socks, and these are just about finished. Now comes an order from the Red Cross for 32,000 articles for our soldiers and the French and Belgians. It doesn't seem as though Rochester could produce all these, but it probably will. Once in a while, for a great treat, I drop the ugly gray things and knit for a while on a blue and white blanket, weaving in all kinds of happy thoughts and loving good wishes." And that blanket was intended for Michael Watson, who, those of you who know Anastasia, that was her dad. Her flying fingers provided a counter-narrative to Gertrude and Isabel's conviction that her small hands looked like they could never do anything. Sadly, the following year, she lost another young man who was very important to her, violinist David Hochstein, who, much to her dismay, enlisted in the military and was killed. This photograph on this slide, and you can see he's in his uniform, and there's kind of an American insignia at the top. It was part of a group of materials, family materials, that was recently acquired. I like to think that it sat on her dressing table. A few years later, she purchased Hochstein's family home to start a music settlement house, now known as the David Hochstein School of Music and Dance, a legacy of a World War I tragedy. By 1920, George Hurdle announced in one of his last annual reports, "It is generally conceded that the efficacy of an art gallery is best to be measured by the degree to which it projects and infuses itself into the life of the community which it is designed to serve. Most particularly in the 7th year of its activity, has the Memorial Art Gallery strengthened its role as the center of the art interests of Rochester. Scarcely any event which required an artistic interpretation or an aesthetic judgment took place without consultation with or the active cooperation of the gallery." And he goes on to list the art features of the Rochester Industrial Exposition, the medals for the homecoming soldiers, the prescribing of color schemes and setting for pageants, expertising in all lines. The community now instinctively turns to the gallery with all questions of artistic portent. This was quite a claim for a relatively young organization. But in spite of influenza and a world war, there was optimism that there were good times to come. Next slide, please. But not for him. In October 1922, nearly 9 years to the day from the opening of his precious beloved art gallery, George Hurdle died of Hodgkin's disease. Fortunately, a few years earlier, his older daughter Gertrude, who we see here, had begun to work as his assistant when she was a student at the University of Rochester, which was, of course, right on the same campus. A 1921 trip to Europe, which was at least partly, if not fully subsidized by Emily Sibley Watson, gave her additional background to step into her father's directorate upon his death. Conventional wisdom would suggest that no move would be taken at MAG without the approval of Mrs. Watson. Consequently, we can believe that, in effect, Emily Sibley Watson was responsible for the appointment of one of the first female museum directors in the world. In her first director's report, Gertrude mourned the loss of her father, whose 13 years devoted to the gallery have achieved, I quote, an enduring record of ministration to the artistic life of this city. As well, she commented on the changes pertaining to two board members, the death of Professor Denio, remember, in the Pants and Cigars, and the relocation of Mrs. William Taylor, the suffragist next door neighbor of Emily Sibley Watson, whose devotion to the welfare of the gallery unfailingly since the first year of its existence would be sorely missed. I just have to add that sadly, Professor Denio was crossing East Avenue one day, was hit by a car driven by the son of another board member of MAG, and subsequently died in hospital of her injuries. But that was a sad, very sad thing. Leaving behind a decade of challenges to MAG, to the community, and to the world, Gertrude looked to the present successes, citing statistics about the growing membership and satisfying size of the permanent collection. The annual report 2 years later included the gift of $100,000, presumably for the Fountain Court edition, which would open the following year, a gift of James and Emily Sibley Watson. Next slide, please. I just felt like we couldn't leave this talk without just commenting on where things were in the first decade. And you can see the kind of brick red rectangle that sits on top of where the original 1913 building was. Then the Fountain Court behind it would probably more than double the size of the original gallery within just a little more than 10 years. And then going to the east, look at the campus that is created. And here I placed Isabel and Gertrude and Susan Schilling looking happily over this practically miraculous complex. Next slide, please. A beautiful container was created to house a beautiful collection. Imagine standing before these enduringly beautiful paintings when the world outside felt so dangerous. These were gifts to MAG from Mrs. Watson. Golden Carnival, the White Bridge, Oxen on the Beach, all just about always on view. These were gifts to MAG from Mrs. Watson, and yet today it would make people reflect on the reasons why it was 60 years before the acquisition of the first painting by an African-American artist, and that would be Jacob Lawrence, and almost 70 years that passed before the acquisition of the first major work by a woman, a gift of the Gallery Council. Next slide, please. MAG started its existence by joining together in spite of differences, by persevering in spite of disease, war, and death. In 2020, MAG heroes and sheroes continue to look for creative ways to contribute to the health and well-being of the community. And as we speak, MAG is preparing to open its doors, as George Hurdle said a century ago, to be measured by the degree to which it projects and infuses itself into the life of the community which it is designed to serve. Just this morning, Jim Memmott cited MAG's efforts, and I hope many of you had an opportunity to read his article. Jim Memmott cited MAG's efforts to reach out into the community in his article, "During a Dark Time, the Arts Have Provided Light," sounding as though it could have been penned by George Hurdle himself. And one day, someone will be giving a talk, beamed directly into the audience's brains, I suppose, in which admiring things will be said about how the diversity of acquisitions and exhibitions is a hallmark of MAG. how valiantly, creatively, and with relevance MAG responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I would just say, look at the numbers of things on this slide that MAG is involved with during this time. And how honestly and directly MAG stood up for racial justice. And I read the paragraph that is on the slide. We stand in solidarity and as steadfast partners with anyone committed to breaking the systems that create and maintain racism, oppression, bigotry, and inequity. We invite you to visit MAG, whether online or in person, when we reopen, and to take the opportunity to view yourself and the world we live in through another person's eyes, to understand the richness and breadth of creativity of people of color, and to share this knowledge is to take a small but meaningful step towards social justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margie. That was amazing. You can only hear my voice, but I speak for legions of people who are on this webinar because I know that they would agree with me. That was absolutely fascinating, entertaining, and I have a ton of questions, and we do have some questions in the Q&A queue. So that's Q&A then line or queue, as it were. And I'm going to ask them of you, if that's all right.
Well, I will try to answer them.
If you can't answer them, then nobody can. Maybe.
Maybe.
First of all, what a wonderful, what a timely talk. We didn't realize that we would be in the midst of this pandemic, but of course the founding of MAG and the early years of MAG, really the early years, MAG found itself in a comparable situation, and maybe even worse, right, with World War I. What a remarkable story. Much good can come from much challenge. But so have you come across other museums that have been founded or by women, or women played a leadership role, directors early on?
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you asked that question. In fact, the Albright Music, as it was called then, before it was the Albright Knox in Buffalo, had a woman director, Cornelia Sage, about 3 years before Gertrude took over. No. 3 years before MAG was founded, I think, in 1910. Interesting, there is a good dissertation that talks about women directors. Oddly, it does not mention MAG because Gertrude was really pretty legendary. Juliana Force at the Whitney. But one thing that I think is really interesting, you can have a woman director, but typically what happened, or several times what happened, is what happened here. There was a man who was in the position of director, and something happened to that man, and there happened to be a very competent woman who had been assisting that man, and lo and behold, she became the director. But what is interesting, and I did really look this up for a bit, is there were few museums that had women on the board. And in a way, that's even a more powerful position. So MAG was, I'm really impressed by how unusual MAG was in that regard.
Interesting, thank you. We have one attendee who says bravo, or brava, as the case may be. Lots of exclamation points. Is there someone mainly responsible for founding the Asian art component in the collection of the MAG?
That's interesting. Well, James Sibley Watson Sr. was particularly interested in Asian art. So for example, the little musical instrument, the musicians that are in the case, those were from him. A number of other objects that he gave. His son, James Sibley Watson Jr., Dr. Watson, also was very interested in Asian art and gave some things. Also, at one point, I would say in the 80s, and maybe starting in the 70s, there was a professor at the university, Dr. Diron Dohanian, whose sister happened to be my middle school math teacher. But that's a digression. In any event, Dr. Dohanian was a very good advisor about the purchase of Asian art. So he assisted with a number of acquisitions. But I would say, again, it was Watson originated.
Thank you. What are the works, what are the most important works that you can recall offhand that Emily Sibley Watson gave to the MAG?
What are the two Monets and the Matisse?
Great.
Yeah, I mean, really, you know?
Yeah.
There's a Picasso work on paper, which is, you know, nice to have, but is not the greatest Picasso in the world. But the tapestries came from, some of the tapestries came from them in the Fountain Court. Of course, they gave the apse in the Fountain Court, but that has some questions of authenticity, which was not unusual at the time that they were donating.
What else do we have here? Tell us about where Emily Sibley Watson got her money to found the gallery.
Well, she happened to have been born as the youngest child and one of only two surviving children out of four. She and her brother Hiram W. Sibley, their father founded Western Union. And in addition to the founding of Western Union, which most people don't know, he owned a lot of real estate. So he bought and sold acres and acres and acres and acres of real estate. He also invested in railroads, in mines. He just capitalized his money in just remarkable ways. I mean, I really think that they were wealthier than George Eastman, you know, at a certain point in time. Then Emily had the good fortune in her second marriage to marry her father's business partner's son. And so both of those fortunes just kind of, you know, cascaded down. So, but the generosity was absolutely stunning to me. These ledgers from which I found the World War I contributions are in the archives of the George Eastman Museum for a complicated reason. But you know, they provide us with wonderful access. But it's just, I mean, for example, she gave Edwina Danforth a car. She was always giving money to the Hurdle sisters. She just, you read that she gave money to the crippled man outside, you know, just, she was a generous human being.
We have more questions. Where did Ms. Watson live and when did she die? And is she buried in Mount Hope Cemetery?
She lived on Prince Street. If you, around the corner from MAG, and of course the university was right there then too. So there's that sort of lovely little brick, I think it's brick, building that looks like a wing of a building that looks like it should be connected to something else, yeah, on Prince Street, across from the what used to be the Sacred Heart chapel. And it has a sculpture sitting in a niche, this little L building. And that was the library wing of the complex of Emily Sibley Watson's house. So there was actually quite a large, beautiful home that was taken down. And in fact, it was given to the university, but the university decided it did not want it. Too bad, Jonathan. Anyway, so her father had that house built for her. She was whisked off to Europe with her two children when her first marriage fell apart. And when she came back, this house was, voila, there it was for her. She died in 1945, you know, of kind of probably hardening of the artery type of diseases and atherosclerosis. And she is buried in Mount Hope Cemetery. And the slab on her grave is really quite charming. And I think it was designed by Fletcher Steele. Her husband is buried next to her. Her parents are there. and J.G. Averill and little Louise are also buried there. So it's right by the gazebo at Mount Hope.
Do you have a sense of what the annual budget for MAG was in the early days?
What a good question. I do not, but that certainly is not hard to find. But I don't.
All right.
It was little, it was very small. And the other thing that was good news was that no matter what it was, if expenses went over, there was a very deep pocket that picked up the tab.
Lean on me.
Right.
Reach out, call. And a question here about Emily Sibley Watson's art collection. You know, she acquired some amazing things and gave them to the MAG. Did she get advice from an art advisor, somebody like a Bernard Berenson, or?
Not that we know of. Now, dealers, I would say that she had close connections with Nerdler, and in the MAG archives are invoices from a number of different dealers. George Hurdle, actually, I think probably was very instrumental in discussing these things with her. But the other thing that is important to remember is that her son, James Sibley Watson Jr., became the publisher of the Dial magazine, and he published work of leading contemporary artists. So she was exposed to many different kinds of things.
And as we approach the hour, we're right on schedule. I think I've selected a good final question for you. Are you going to publish any books on Emily Sibley Watson? Can we have a book signing soon?
Yeah. Well, Lou and I have talked about this a lot. One thing that we love about the website is that it's infinitely expandable, and as new information comes along, you can just change it. But one thing that I have thought about, and I don't know how we would do it, would be, wouldn't it be nice to have sort of a little biography of Emily that could be available, you know, not the whole, 9 yards of everything that was ever written or published, but just something that would talk about her, because there's really nothing at this point. So, that would be a lovely thing to do. A beautiful little publication. So I don't know. I
can say, I think the founding story, and there is another question has popped up, but the founding story of the MAG is fascinating, and it like all founding stories is unique, but unique in many special ways, as you've indicated in your talk and in your research, and with Lou Harper and in her research. I think a book like that would be great. I always talk about the founding of the MAG when anyone visits and I'm giving a director's kind of introduction or tour. I begin always with that story, because it provides just a quick, taste, a sense of the richness of the history, and how much love has been given to this place for so long by people, just people. Some of greater means, some of lesser means, people who give resources of all kinds. But I, as the director, appreciate all the details you've been providing, because it really provides a lot of nuance and fun too. There's some really interesting tidbits in there that one can use, but very important story for all of us. Here's a question. When Emily Sibley Watson was in Europe, did she acquire paintings? Is that when she acquired these European masterworks, or maybe? No. There are receipts that indicate that she had artworks delivered to her on her yacht. That always, as one does. And I always loved reading things like that. I think that, I think sometimes George Hurdle picked them up in New York for her. And, but now her father bought, that's something I should also mention. Her father had quite a significant art collection. So she, from the age of 10, she was exposed to art in Europe. So she, this was in her blood. But she didn't, that I know of, she did not typically buy art on her trips. But her father did. Okay. Margie, you've been amazing. thank you for doing this for us. It's a real gift.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for asking.
Gift. I want to tell everyone who attended today that we're going to send out a survey in about a week or within a week. It's a quick survey. We'd love to hear your feedback on the format. The questions will be there. Your comments would be greatly appreciated, as we're always striving to do better and to give our audience and our community more of what it wants and more of what it needs. So please do let us know how you think things went today once you get that survey. Margie, you're the best. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure for a lifetime.
Can I keep calling you if I have questions?
Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Anytime. And thanks, Bella, for your help. You were great.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the day. Enjoy the beautiful evening. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Hopefully very soon inside the galleries themselves. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Take care.